Well, let's get some more analysis. We can speak now to Kurt Volker, who's a former US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and former US Ambassador to NATO. He joins us from Virginia in the United States. Thank you very much indeed for joining us once again, Ambassador. Let's start by talking about that 28-point plan that surfaced last week. Some Europeans and some US officials called it a list of Russian positions and not a serious proposal. What went through your mind when you first saw that 28-point plan last week?
Yes, exactly. My first reaction was, here we go again. We have adopting Russian proposals, putting some pressure on Ukraine. This is clearly not going to go anywhere. The Ukrainians can't accept it. The Europeans can't accept it. And we'll end up with amending this. We'll fix this somehow. And then Russia will refuse to accept it. And then we're right back at trying to figure out how to pressure Putin to have a ceasefire. So, one more round, just like we had at the Alaska summit, all over again.
Right. So you think, in fact, Ukraine has played its cards quite skillfully by not showing any resistance to this plan, perhaps in the knowledge, as you say, that the plan was never going to see the light of day. Is that roughly what you think the calculation might have been in Kyiv?
Well, I think they know that rather than confronting Trump and arguing with the United States, it's better to say, we're always willing to talk, we're always willing to negotiate, we're ready to meet anytime, anywhere. Let's get to work on this. And that's exactly what they did. And Rubio was dispatched to go do that. And Rubio could see this plan for what it was and knew that it had to be adjusted. So I think this was all very well played to take something that was unacceptable and turn it into something acceptable that puts the onus back on the Russians to agree to a ceasefire or not.
Right, so now that it's acceptable to Ukraine, and as President Trump said yesterday, it's been, quote, fine-tuned, what you're saying now is it's now become unacceptable to the Russians, and therefore they're going to reject it outright, do you think?
Yes, I do. I think from what we heard from Foreign Minister Lavrov this morning, I don't expect them to actually engage on any negotiations. I think they're going to say, no, we were prepared to work off of the original plan, but we're not prepared to work off of this one. Just no negotiating. That's what I expect from them.
So Steve Witkoff, who's going to Russia next week, we're told, will be at the Kremlin holding talks with Jared Kushner, according to reports. Are they going to be wasting their time?
Well, look, I suppose it's always good to go and talk. And hopefully they begin to learn. The fact that Witkoff had these conversations with Russian officials as if Russia's a partner and Ukraine is an object that we just have to, divide up ourselves, that is clearly not the right way to be understanding what's going on in the world. And hopefully with a plan that President Trump, President Zelenskyy, European leaders are all comfortable with, to then get a dose of this is all unacceptable from Russia, maybe that will be a little bit of a wake-up call.
Right, you're alluding to this leaked report by Bloomberg, which says that Putin's foreign policy advisor was given some coaching and some prepping by Steve Witkoff on how to sell this plan to President Trump. I assume that's what you're alluding to. And
yes.
And one Republican, in fact, by the name of Don Bacon, who's a Nebraska Republican, said that that leak proves that Witkoff favors the Russians. And that's coming from a Republican. I mean, what's been the reaction there amongst your colleagues and former colleagues to this news that Steve Witkoff has been helping the Russians to pitch their plan back to America? I mean, it's very unusual, isn't it?
It certainly is. And I don't know. I haven't spoken to anyone this morning yet about their views on this, but my guess is that no one is surprised. That Witkoff has adopted a Russian view of this from the beginning. And so it's no surprise that he's talking with them about what the plan should be and how to pitch it. What is really striking to me is that, as I said, Russia is the aggressor here. Russia is killing civilians. They're seizing territory from another country. They're abducting children. They're erasing Ukrainian language and culture wherever they can. And this proposal acts as though, well, Russia is the partner of the United States, or the U.S. is Russia's partner, and Ukraine is the problem to be limited and to be carved up and to be put in its place. That is just a fundamentally wrong way of understanding what's going on here and a wrong way of understanding American interests. Now, what's interesting is I don't think President Trump was ever bought into this plan. I think he just wants peace, and he wants there to be a process for how to get there, and he doesn't really care about the details. So with Witkoff and maybe also Vice President Vance saying, well, here's a plan. I think Trump's view is, yeah, give it a try. And then when it encountered so much resistance from not only the Ukrainians, but Europeans and Republicans in the Congress and in the Senate and experts, the media, everyone saw right through this. Trump said, well, it's not the final plan. There will be adjustments. And, the deadline's not really a deadline because, if we're making progress, deadlines come and go. And so then he dispatches Rubio to go fix it. And Rubio does that in his meetings with the Ukrainians and European leaders. And now it looks as though emerging from that is a reasonable plan that people can live with. And this is where now Russia's going to say, oh, well, we can't live with that.
Okay, we mentioned quite a lot of the well-known names in this discussion. They've been names we've talked about on this channel for several months, the Steve Witkoffs, the Jared Kushners, the Marco Rubios. But there's one name you haven't mentioned so far, and I want to ask you about him. The US Secretary of the Army, Dan Driscoll. Perhaps less well-known internationally than some of those other people we've talked about. But he seems to have been playing a pretty central role in brokering this agreement. How important do you think his role has been?
Well, I think it is helpful. It's good to have someone who is expert in military affairs, which he is, who can talk to the Ukrainians. I think that he will observe that the Ukrainians have done a lot with their own technology, their own drones, their own electronic warfare, that they've been able to hold off the Russians pretty effectively. So I think he'll gain some appreciation for that from his meetings. As a former military guy, he's not going to be a political leader. He's not going to be making decisions about what the U.S. policy is. That's only Donald Trump, really. But military guys tend to be very direct and very straight about representing what the political leadership wants. And so I think he'll do that effectively. But again, I have to stress the only decision maker here is President Trump. And this is why you have a Witkoff plan that goes off the rails. Why then Trump steps in, you get Rubio, he pulls it back. Now you have more talks with Witkoff and Driscoll. But ultimately, the fundamentals have not changed. The fundamentals are that Vladimir Putin started this war and continues this war. And if you want the war to end, it's going to be Vladimir Putin who has to decide to have a ceasefire, because nobody else wants the war. The Ukrainians are ready for a ceasefire, Europe, United States. It's only Putin, and Putin has to be the one to call for a ceasefire or to accept a ceasefire. And he'll only do that if he feels that he is facing very difficult financial and military choices. Right now, he doesn't feel that.
And Ambassador, when we talk about all these different names and these different approaches to this same issue, are you getting the sense that there are some divisions and some, perhaps, for lack of a better word, some tensions in the ranks of the Trump administration on, how to solve this problem and who is ultimately going to get the ball across the line?
Yeah, I think so. And it boils down to a couple of issues. One of them is Marco Rubio is confirmed by the Senate and nominated by President Trump as the Secretary of State. He is actually responsible for U.S. foreign affairs by statute, even though, the reality can always vary person to person. But here you have Steve Witkoff, who has no confirmed role, but is a friend of President Trump who steps in and tries to do things with the Russians. And Witkoff has no idea about the culture, the history, the language, the diplomacy. He's never been to Ukraine. And so the plan that he comes up with is drafted by the Russians and has gross mistakes, errors, naivetes. It's fully one-sided. It says things such as, in one place, there'll be a recognition that parts of Ukraine are de facto controlled by Russia. Well, that's a non sequitur. If they're de facto controlled, it means you don't recognize it in diplomatic terms. If you recognize it, you are legitimizing it as being Russian, which we should never do. So even that was just a a fundamental flaw in the plan, and there are many others. So I think this causes tension between some of the actors in the Trump administration, whether there's expertise or non-expertise, whether there is official responsibility or informal activity. And we saw this also, I would just mention that the Special Envoy for Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, announced at the same time that this plan came out that he is not planning to stay on in his role after January. So I think that is also a reflection of the fact that the guy who's supposed to be responsible for this is not actually given the responsibility.
Right, and actually, interestingly enough, last week we spoke to a former US ambassador to Ukraine on the day that the 28-point plan came to light. And his initial reaction to it was that this was fake news and that this was could not possibly be an official government position from the United States. I mean, is that roughly what you thought?
No, I believed it. I fully believed that this is what Witkoff and others are capable of, but it wouldn't remain the U.S. position, that this was something that was cooked up with Dmitriev, Putin's envoy, but it was going to fizzle out because it's not something that anyone could reasonably support. So it'll get changed, and we'll be back where we were again. And that is, in fact, exactly how it's playing out.
Does it feel like now is the right time to be making a deal, or do you think perhaps there's an argument for leaving this for a while and perhaps giving Ukraine a slightly stronger position to negotiate from, as opposed to the week when President Zelenskyy is embroiled in a corruption scandal in the ranks of his own cabinet, and perhaps approach it at a slightly different point in time? What do you think about that?
Well, I think what you're getting at is that the conditions have to be right for the Russians to want to end the war. Ukraine already wants to end the war. They never wanted the war to begin with. They were attacked. But to get the Russians to stop, you got to get the conditions for them to want that. And we haven't ever done that. We need to ramp up the pressure on their finances, their economy, deliver the longer range weapons that Ukraine can use to go after military sites deep inside Russia. Those are things that we have still not done. But if we do those things, if we increase the pressure on Putin, it is the time to press him and say, look, this is bad already for you, and it's going to keep getting worse unless you do a deal or unless you have a ceasefire. So do this now. I also think that we will end up with a ceasefire but no agreement. Putin will never back off of his maximalist demands to eliminate Ukraine as an independent state. But he could possibly agree to a ceasefire where we're not pursuing this by military means anymore. And that's what I think we should be aiming at. Change the conditions, make it harder for Putin, starve the finances, and then also call for an immediate ceasefire.
So just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, President Trump sounds very optimistic about this plan, and he thinks that, perhaps we're the closest we've ever been to ending this war. I mean, it really doesn't sound like you share that optimism in the slightest.
I don't. No, I don't. I think it's good for Rubio to be talking this up as progress. You don't want Trump to conclude that the Ukrainians are obstructing progress. So you want to think there's progress. And for President Trump to be talking it up, hopefully that raises the stakes on Putin in terms of his just rejecting it outright. Maybe he won't just reject it outright. But that being said, I don't buy it. I think that this is not real progress, and Putin, because real progress would depend on Putin being willing to end the war, and we simply don't see that.
Okay, we can leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate it. Kurt Volker, former US Special Representative for Ukraine and negotiations, and former US Ambassador to NATO. Thank you for your time, sir.
My pleasure. Thank you.